A very good evening to all who have joined for the session. On behalf of Department of Visual Communication, Kumaraguru College of Liberal Arts and Science, I take immense pleasure in welcoming our prominent personality, guest for the session, Professor Mark Deuze. I thank the management and our beloved principal for their immense support in organizing this international lecture series with eminent personalities across the globe in organizing in partnership with International Association for Media and Communication Research and with our event partner, Media and Information Literacy India Network. I'm really honored and excited to have Professor Mark Deuze with us, who is the co-author of McWell's Media and Mass Communication Theory, the 7th edition of SAGE. Dennis McWell books have been our reference book during the course of media studies, not only in India, across the world. This is the case. His books have been a foundational material for most of the media courses. Having such an expert who have worked with McWell with us today is a great privilege. And this would extend the scope of our lecture series. Recently, I watched Professor Mark Deuze's explanation of digital footprints and our lives being under surveillance with his example of the movie Truman Show, which most of us would have watched, where he asks a question, okay, what if the protagonist decides to stay in the media trapped world? The answer is nothing but the way we live today in this digital world. Deuze also said our lives takes place inside media, where the result could be dichotomous, either empowerment or information slavery. His lecture on political economy, media ownership, media maintaining the status quo rather than being critical. Say, for instance, we have digital India stories such as the digital apps, digital registration for vaccination or flooding in, rather than critical stories on readiness of healthcare system and investment on healthcare infrastructure for encountering the second wave. Yes, India being the world's largest internet market, Digital India is not a utopian dream at all. The Digital India focus on developing infrastructure for digitization to enable information dissemination and effective delivery of public services. Platformization has helped business and trade created new opportunities for startups and entrepreneurs, particularly during the pandemic. And there is a paradigm shift in journalism, which is becoming more and more participatory with regional and local entrepreneurial journalism. The paradigm could be beneficial at a larger scale for media pluralism and also for the indigenous people who are not in the spectrum of digital inclusion due to the lack of digital content in their native languages. This can also address the issues of marginalized communities. This platformization has also blurred the boundary of producer and consumers. With all this, when we speak about digital inclusion, I would like to mention few lines of UNESCO report on leveraging digital technologies for social inclusion. It says, leaving no one behind means leaving no one offline. Yet half of the world population does not have internet access. Disparity in ICT access due to various reasons like regional disparity, income, age, sex, ethnicity, and disability does exist. UNESCO report also highlighted that around 800 million students are without household computer, 700 lakh internet access at home, and around 15 million do not have mobile 3G or 4G network. This is the scenario even today. Yes, more and more governments are leveraging the technologies to deliver information, render public services effectively. They're investing on technologies for social progression. Yes, but there are alarming signs of gap being widening, the digital divide fostering social divide. That should be taken into account today. And this year, the World Press Freedom Day focus on information as a public good, which means that this highlights on information for empowering the society at a larger scale and also strengthening the journalism for more transparent and empowering the society, leaving no one behind. So we as a journal media students have a social responsibility when it comes to inclusive society. At this juncture, digital inclusion should strive for social inclusion, ensuring an inclusive society. When it comes to digital inclusion, last mile connectivity, and developing an environment for imparting digital literacy becomes imperative. Today, our guest, who would be shortly releasing his book on media love. This book would definitely explain media dependency based on an emotional factor called love, and will guide the media students to create a socially responsible media environment with love. So, with this note, I hand over the session to Professor Ananda, who would give a detailed intro about Professor Mark Deuze. Over to you, Ananda.
Thank you so much, Professor Devika, for setting the context. Um, we are indeed really happy and glad to have Professor Mark Deuze with us today. He's a professor of media studies, especially specializing in journalism at the University of Amsterdam's Faculty of Humanities. He's worked at Indiana University's Department of Telecommunications in Bloomington from 2004 to 2013. And before transitioning to academia, Professor Deuze worked as a freelance reporter in the Netherlands and South Africa. His published work includes more than 50 articles in academic journals and seven books, including Media Work and Media Life, both by Polity Press. His work has been translated into Chinese, German, Portuguese, Greek, and Hungarian. In 2008, he received a visiting research fellowship through the Center for International Communications Research of the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom, and he was a visiting Fulbright scholar from 2002 to 2003. His interest in entrepreneurial journalism stems from his overall focus on creativity as the driving force for those who make media. I would like to welcome Professor Deuze to the screen. Our heartiest warm welcome, sir.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for these kind and inspiring introductions. I really appreciate it, and thanks everybody for logging in. I regrettably can't see you, but you have a warm place in my heart for all of you. And I appreciate the time you're taking to participate in this entire day, dedicated to world freedom of the press, and issues related to digital exclusion and media and information literacy. And what I wanted to do at the end of this I'm sure has been a long day for most of you, is to share a couple of thoughts about, first of all, why we care, we as in students and scholars and the world at large, to be fair, about media and information literacy, what kind of approaches we have developed to talk about, to think about, and to develop media literacy or digital literacy even. Then what seems to be missing from all of this, which my argument will be, is love. And what taking our love for media seriously brings to our understanding of the world we live in today. So those are going to be my three main points, I look forward to hearing your thoughts and your comments, either now live or later on Twitter, where you can find me, where I spend most of my time, or on Facebook, or of course via email. Be happy to hear from you. Let's start from a very simple and basic premise. And this is a premise that I developed while I was working in the United States, in Indiana, and one of my most dear colleagues there in the Department of Telecommunications was a professor originally from India, Harmeet Sawhney, the editor of the Information Society. Harmeet was sort of my mentor as I sort of came of age as an academic. And I was working, as the introduction suggests, on issues related to creativity, the creativity of journalists, of advertising, people in advertising, of people in film and television, of people in the games industry. And I wrote articles and books about this. And when we were sort of reviewing my work and what next, I distinctly remember having tea one afternoon with Harmeet, and he says, "Well, it almost seems, Mark, that you're telling us that we're all living a media life." And we were both laughing, and I didn't think much of it. And then I walked home and I thought about this media life. That sounds interesting. That sounds provocative, generative. All kinds of ideas and images started rolling around in my head, and that's when I started writing this book, which then came out in 2011, exactly 10 years ago, called Media Life. And that book had a very simple premise, inspired by the wise words of Harmeet, is that we don't live with media anymore, we live in media. And what if that's truly the case? What are the different ways we can think about ourselves and each other, our communities and our lives as this all plays out in media? Now, to be fair, this seemed at the time largely an academic exercise. It was a fun thinking exercise. I distinctly remember having so much fun writing that book because I used examples from music, from films, from video games, from art and literature, and I just having a ball. So fast forward from 2010 and 11, when I finished the book Media Life, to 2020 and 21, when the world has become united in its experience ongoing of the coronavirus crisis. And all of a sudden you realize this is not a fun thinking exercise anymore. This is how we all directly experience life. We are all living in media at the moment. And the consequence thereof is fairly straightforward in the sense that if you live with media, you can switch them off and you're fine, right? I mean, that's the assumption of using the word with. But if you live in media, there's no switching off. Maybe you switch your media off, but everybody else around you still have them all switched on, and you cannot function meaningfully in society without your media. There is always an element of media in everything you do, in every experience you have, in every way you make sense of things, in every way society interacts with you and acts upon you. So we live in media, we experience our life in media. And what kind of life are we living at the moment? And I guess the two dominant trends of our lives in media are, interestingly, they're of course related, but they also seem to be oppositional in the sense that on the one hand, our life in media is very much a life determined by mass self-communication. This concept originally coined by Manuel Castells, a Spanish sociologist working at one of the universities I used to work with, at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where I was a Fulbright professor. And Castells suggests that, that most of our communication these days is self-communication. We communicate about ourselves both voluntarily, our Facebook status updates, our contributions to any kind of social media platforms, and so on and so forth, but also our engagement with other types of sort of digital services that require us to communicate about ourselves. Think about Uber and Airbnb and all those kind of platforms, but also involuntary in the sense that every keystroke we make, every time we go online with any kind of device or app or software, our interactions, our actions are logged, are stored, they're turned into data, which is then sold to advertisers and to other types of businesses and companies and used by security services and governments all over the world. So mass self-communication on the one hand, as the dominant mode of living in media, and on the other hand, algorithmic selection, in the sense that all this mass self-communication generates an enormous amount of data, which in turn, to some extent, determines what we hear, what we see, what we do, more specifically, what we can and cannot do when we live our lives in media. Algorithms operate on the background of everything. The simplest example is Netflix. Everything you see on a Netflix screen, every option, every image, every piece of text, every button is a recommendation generated by an algorithm. And that's the most obvious and blatant example of algorithmic selection. But algorithm selection determines how police officers do their job, right? An algorithm spits out data on where crime is most likely to happen next, who are the most likely offenders. I mean, all of this is generated by algorithms. And that doesn't mean algorithms control our lives. It does mean, however, that a life in media is both generated by our own individual actions as well as by the selection mechanisms of algorithms. And so these are two sort of interesting, both competing as well as mutually reinforcing powers that structure our lives in media as we're all experiencing them now. And I think a third overall comment that I want to make in this brief talk is how our life in media has taught us, or made us aware, how much we all really, really love media. And now love is an interesting concept, right? It is a syndrome, it is an emotion. Some say it's not an emotion, it's a whole range of emotions. It's a lot of different things. But at its heart, love is intimate, it's personal, it is deeply affective in the sense that it's a powerful feeling. It really structures and determines almost everything we do. And as everything we do involves media, our love for and in media needs to be taken seriously. Our media are profoundly intimate to us. They've become more intimate throughout their history, right? In the 20th century, our media were often impersonal, far away. The television in one room of the house, the phone in the hallway, if you had a phone or if you had a television. They were bulky, they were big, they were difficult to operate with big devices, with buttons and stuff like that. And today, I mean, more people in the world have access to a smartphone than access to clean water, right? So and smartphones are soft and warm and operate to touch and your voice spoken softly. They don't have buttons, right? Yes, the buttons are digital, but they change depending on what kind of app you use. They are haptic, right? They operate on touch, on subtlety, on and these devices live close to us, on us, right? They are designed, our clothes are designed to accommodate them. Our media are incredibly personal, they're intimate, and of course, the experiences we have through our media are incredibly personal and intimate. So this is kind of the broad picture of our lives in media. Now, in order to make sure that we all live a good life in media, which has two connotations. One, good life as in, like, you know, we're having fun, we're getting out of life what we want, and we're happy. And another definition of good would be you're a good person, a good citizen, you know, taking responsibility, accepting accountability, trying to not just do things that are good for you, but also to help or benefit the lives of others. I mean, those are the two definitions of good life that we're kind of generally sort of evaluate health and well-being with. And for that, it's obvious that simply acknowledging that we live in media is not enough. We need more, because media are complicated. are difficult, are hard to understand. Media are black boxes. Media are constructed, right? They like I said earlier with the Netflix example, they're not neutral. They steer us towards certain ideas, certain ways of doing, certain ways of acting. They open things up as much as they close things down. Media are so ubiquitous and pervasive, and we love them so much that we need help in really figuring them out and turning them into assets, into tools to live with, rather than technologies that we rely on. Enter debates on media and information literacy. I mean, these are old debates. I mean, they started already in the 1970s, at least in the 1970s, and continue to this day. The notion that we need some kind of media and information literacy to help us deal with the media in our lives. Now, of course, originally, when we were talking about media and information literacy, we talked about that from a perspective of the modern era, of mass media, of print newspapers and of books and magazines, of mass media broadcasting, radio and television. And so much of our original ideas about media and information literacy were very much like that. They were top-down. They were protectionist, designed to protect us from the potential risks and harms of media, of being controlled by the media, of understanding when is something information and when is something an advertisement. I mean, the sort of original idea of media literacy was to help us being inoculated against media. It's almost like the COVID vaccine, right? We should all get a vaccine to be stronger when faced with dominant top-down mass media, who were the only ones who had a megaphone in society. With the advent of the digital era, when we're talking about the 1990s and the early 2000s, ideas about media and information literacy started to change somewhat. And rather than talking about inoculation and protection, we started to talk more about skills and competences. Digital competence, things everybody should be able to do. For example, being able to distinguish, factual news from fake news, or being able to find what you're looking for online. And when you find something, being able to evaluate this kind of information. So skills and competences. As we are all very much moving into a thoroughly digital sort of computational world where all the devices that we now use are basically computers, right? Whether it's your phone or your smart television set, or of course your laptop, all these devices have now become computers. And what do computers do? I mean, computers introduce really interesting element into our media repertoire, which is an element of us making our own reality. I mean, the biggest shift from the old modern mass media to today's digital computerized media you could say is the shift from, a small group of people and technologies sort of broadcasting their voice all over the world to each and everyone becoming and getting their own voice. Right? My experience on my computer is always different from your experience on your computer. Whereas if you and I watching the same TV show, our experiences are pretty much the same. Okay, I may like the show and you may hate it, but that's about the extent of the difference. But the moment a computer is involved, we start programming, we start changing things around, we start messing things up, because that's what computers allow us to do. And that changes also our ideas about literacy. So from, protecting us against the media to, arguing for a set of very specific competences and skills, you see sort of a new definition of media and information literacy evolving from, let's say, the 2010s until now, which is much more about participatory culture, about co-creating, about making media as a way to teach and learn about media. Acknowledging, of course, that the media we all grow up with are not just media we passively consume, it's media we actively engage in, that we interact with, that we co-create, that we make. Like I said in Media Life, that book from 10 years ago, when we use media, we make reality. My dogs are going nuts. And the most recent ideas about media and information literacy are even more complex than those three versions that I talked about before. I mean, we're now moving towards an idea about media literacy that says, look, we have to abandon this notion of literacy that is tied to specific media. Let's say, the internet, television, radio, film, games. Because, the argument goes, most people don't live in media that way. We live in a sort of all-encompassing environment. Media are our environment. Media are a manifold, is another notion. Media are a figuration, right? An ensemble of different technologies, different platforms, different images. I mean, we seamlessly move from watching a piece of a movie to updating our Facebook profile, to answering a text, to browsing through a magazine. And this is like half a minute of our day. And we spend between 10 to 12 hours a day in and with media. So how can you talk about literacy in terms of parsing out all those experiences and different media? That's impossible. You have to develop an idea of literacy that is transliterate, that cuts across all these different platforms. And you have to acknowledge that, for example, when a child enters school, he or she already has had a lifetime of mediated experiences, including mediated knowledge and skills and competences that you can't just unlearn. You have to acknowledge, you have to work with that. So this is a much more richer and complex notion of media literacy, if you will, that cuts across all different media, that takes whatever you're doing at home or when you're out with your friends seriously, that acknowledges that we're all developing ways of being in media, repertoires, to make a reference to the worlds of acting and the theater, that help us to sort of deal with this reality that we're all making in media. Now, these four stages of thinking about media and information literacy, from very top-down, protectionist, inoculate yourself against media, to the more recent sort of bottom-up, participatory, co-creative, trans-media literacy ideas, they all exist side by side. I mean, depending on which school you're going, with which educator you talk to, which policymaker you have a conversation with, you'll find examples of all these types of thinking and all these different ways of defining media and information literacy. They exist. I mean, it suggests that this is a moving object. This is a difficult field, but at least we're now all in agreement that this is incredibly important, that we need to think about this carefully and critically, that without media literacy, people simply won't survive in this world. Now, and that's where things get really interesting. If we start thinking about media not as sort of this extra thing in our lives that gives us entertainment and joy, or this perhaps necessary thing in our lives that gives us access to important information and facts, but as a survival skill and mechanism, media as essential to life. When we start thinking about media in those terms, we're entering a whole new world of consequences and assumptions. And my suggestion is that this year, this Corona year, has sort of amplified that way of thinking. We have all come to realize, oh my God, we completely rely on media. I mean, can you imagine surviving this year without media? If we wouldn't have had this, video conferencing, and if we wouldn't have had movie streaming services, if we wouldn't have had ways in which to hang out together, to see our friends and family members, to stay in touch. And that's just our personal needs. What about telemedicine, e-health, all the sort of technological and media-related applications that inform our approach and our ways of dealing with this coronavirus crisis. It's impossible to fathom all of this without media, including protest movements, including people who don't agree with everything that's going on and still finding ways to get engaged with the world around them. Media are everywhere, are crucial. So I want to conclude my introduction, or my talk today, is by combining these two fundamental insights. One, that we live in media, and that we clearly love media, with evolving notions of media literacy. Because I think these two ideas need each other to get at a third stage, which is a stage of true digital inclusion, of a true society, a digital society, and a life that we all live in media that is both possible and meaningful to all, that allows us, like I said in the beginning, to live a good life, both in terms of our own fun and enjoyment, as well as a life that contributes to the health and benefits of others. So what does a perspective on love do to help us get there? I want to posit 3 hypotheses that love brings to this discussion. And the first one is one that sort of prompted me to, as the introduction mentioned as well, to sign a book contract with Polity Press for a new book called Media Love that I'm working on at the moment. And that happened when, in February last year, at a press conference of the World Health Organization, it was announced that the COVID virus had reached the stage of a pandemic. So it was the first acknowledgement that this wasn't a localized infection or disease anymore, but this was truly a pandemic, a global manifestation of an infectious disease that required every single country in the world to get on it, to act, to take it seriously. But at that same conference, as you may remember, it was announced that not only is there a corona pandemic, there's a parallel, and this is what was literally said, an equally fatal infodemic. In other words, the world of the virus as it existed online, the way, for example, people were talking about it on social media, the way different agencies and bureaucrats and policymakers and health experts were informing people about the virus, that entire mediated existence of the virus not only was just as big as the virus itself, it was equally fatal. Right? Access to bad information about the virus can lead to disease and death. Now, I don't know about you, but I found that shocking. Not so much that there is something like disinformation online. Of course there is. I mean, I don't know about you, but have you ever sat in a bar or in a cafe and listened to the people next to you talk with each other? 9 out of 10 times they're talking about things that they have no idea what they're talking about. They're just talking crap. That's us. That's humans. We are not experts on everything. That's fine. But the moment you amplify that on a global scale and talking about a virus, all of that can lead to profound consequences. And this acknowledgement that the world in media and the world outside of media not only have merged, that the boundary is gone, but that they are equally consequential for our chances for survival, blew my mind. I mean, the only time I've seen such an acknowledgement of the two worlds colliding was in a science fiction novel that was published in 1992 called Snow Crash. And in that novel, there is people live part of their lives in a virtual reality called the metaverse. It was a novel that predicted a lot of what's happening in the world, in the metaverse. And there is this group of people that have unleashed a virus into the world that both acts in the physical world as well as in the metaverse simultaneously. The virus called Snow Crash. and it's a fantastic novel. If you find it, try to read it. Actually, a lot of our work that people do at Google is inspired by this novel. For example, Google Earth and Wikipedia, they all feature in this novel. That's beside the point. The point is, it was also mentioned just now in the introduction, right, that UNESCO has said that leaving no one behind in this world equals leaving no one offline, which is a similar acknowledgement that the worlds in and outside of media have completely collapsed. And I think this is a recognition of love, in the sense that how could that have happened if it wasn't for the fact that we have invested ourselves completely into our devices, into the things that we experience through these devices, and in what experiences these devices offer us, right? The music we listen to, the movies we watch, the television series we talk about at work or at school. I mean, we clearly love all of this, and that's okay. But the moment you recognize that, you have to acknowledge that there is no more distinction between media and life. That worrying about media isn't something that media students do, but that every single human being should do. And that is amazing. That is the basis for understanding. That is the starting point for a debate with each other. That's a beautiful thing. A second contribution that love can make is, or should be, an appreciation that our love for media is all about imperfection. And let me explain. You could argue that everything we study and everything that we learn about when we learn about media and communication, as scholars of media studies or communication science, people in our information studies and information science as well, you could add them to that, that all our studies, all our theories, all the projects that we do are about solving the problem of mediated communication. Every single one. Why do we worry about media effects? Why do we write books and books and books about how people interpret certain films or certain authors? Why study how people get inspired to do something or not do something by watching an ad on television or something like that? Because deep down inside, we know that mediated communication never goes perfectly. Ever. It just doesn't. And this is a problem that we need to solve. How can we communicate more effectively, right? How do we solve the infodemic? By telling people what they should know about the virus in a more effective way. How can journalists regain credibility? By doing more fact-checking. How can, all of these things. How can our product sell more? Well, by having a better ad that speaks directly to the consumer, or, all that kind of, it's lovely that we keep doing this, but it's also pointless, because imperfection is not the problem of mediated communication. It is the solution. So if you acknowledge that the reason that we love media and mediated communication and our lives in media so much is in part because we love to, talk about ourselves, to figure out who we are, to figure out where we belong, and to establish and maintain our sense of community, and to have fun. The fundamentals of life. One thing that we have to acknowledge, that there is no way of doing this perfectly, and that we all make mistakes, and that no matter how long I worked on that perfect email I'm sending to my friend or my lover or the person who I want to be my lover or my employer, they will still not get it the way I intended. It's impossible, right? Communication, mediated communication is essentially imperfect. And that is not a problem we can solve by better or more communication. It's something we have to acknowledge as a starting point for all communication. And let's just acknowledge that my world that exists in my head will always be different from yours, even if we are exposed to the same information completely. And that difference is beautiful. That is perfection. The imperfection is what makes life interesting and beautiful, not the perfection. Right? For people who worry that all this love for media and all this life in media turns us into robots, I say it will only do that if we start acting like robots. And we act like robots if we assume that we can communicate perfectly, because that's what robots do. We don't. And that's where beauty is. So that's a second contribution that love makes to this entire debate. And the last one came to me over the last 10 years. When I finished with Media Life, I started a blog called Why I Heart My Media. You can find it online. It's one word, whyiheartmymedia.com. And in that blog, every year when I teach my classes to my students, whether in Indiana or in Amsterdam or anywhere else in the world where I'm allowed to give a guest lecture, I ask students to voluntarily, they don't have to, contribute to this blog. And I tell them, like, I would love to know why you love your media, why I heart my media. And it could be anything. They're allowed to write a story or submit a link to a YouTube clip, whatever they feel like. And over the years, hundreds if not thousands of students have contributed to this blog. And when I look back at all these contributions, I see 4 reasons why we love media so much. First of all, many people say, I love media because it allows me to express myself, right? I can be who I really am in media. I can say what I want to say, or I can find whatever I want to find, what entertains me, what I love. I'm only interested in metal, and in media, I can find, my favorite bands, and I can listen to that, and that's great. So expression, being who you really are. Secondly, in media, I can explore myself. I can discover new things and ideas, new ways of being, new different aspects of my identity. I can play with aspects of my identity that I often can't do outside of media. And this has powerful consequences. I mean, think about it. What if you are gay, but you grow up in a community where that is not okay? I mean, then in media, you can find... Or what if you're convinced that you're not really human, but you are actually an alien? I mean, there's communities of otherkin, that's how these people are called, online, where they can find support. And so on and so forth. So that's the second part, identity, expression, identity. And the third one is belonging. It's like in media, I can keep in touch with my friends, with my mom and dad, with parents, with grandparents, with colleagues, especially in a globalizing world where we are increasingly less likely to spend our entire life in one geographical location. Media provide a powerful lifeline, a network, but it's more stable than a network. In that sense, the network society is a problematic concept, because a property of networks is that they disappear over time. But often the communities that we develop online and in media are quite just as strong as the friendships we build offline. Obviously, there's no distinction anymore. And finally, so belonging and community. And the final reason why people love media, as they express it on this group blog that I've been maintaining for the last 10 years, is, as one student wrote about it, it's like sometimes you can express things, you feel things that are just too overwhelming to express, at home or with your friends, whether it's passion or anger or frustration. And in media, you can. In media, it's okay. But, I mean, there's a good reason why studying love letters is such a wonderful aspect of the study of literature, because in love letters, people express feelings that are overwhelming. I mean, if you would just sit down and have a chat, that you couldn't find the words. But if you take some time and write them down, all of a sudden you can be so powerful and so expressive that it's hard to do offline or outside of media. So that's a fourth reason why we love media so much. Now, so why is this relevant and important? Well, I think that for all our talk about how we should be worried about media and about disinformation, about fake news, and about what people do or not do with media and all that kind of thing, we sometimes forget that the reason why we're all living in media is not just because media are super powerful and they control us while doing so. No, it's because we love it. We love to express ourselves. We love to figure out who we are and where we belong to, and to cultivate and play with that. And we love being able to really, really feel. That may be a counterintuitive statement, right? But that I would actually acknowledge that we actually truly feel as deeply as we can in media rather than outside of them. So my argument, and this is my final sentence, is that these ideas, I think, when those ideas infuse our discussions about media literacy, they can lead, hopefully, more to our ideals of digital inclusion. Look, and digital inclusion has an instrumental component, which is based on a very simple idea that is at the heart of my entire story today, which is that, look, the world and societies are unequal. Ergo, whatever happens in media is unequal too. Furthermore, media tend to amplify what's already there. Remember my story about strong feelings that you can express in media, but have a hard time doing that outside of them. The same thing happens with all the things that are wrong in society. The oppression of women, the sidelining and marginalization of minorities, especially those with disabilities, the invisibility of our senior citizens and the elderly from any kind of societal event or discussion. I mean, all of that gets amplified in media and therefore contributes to digital exclusion. However, you can also turn that around by acknowledging the amorous, if you will, reasons why we are in media in the first place, and to acknowledge that that is the starting point for our discussion. Now, I've already talked way too long and way too much. I do appreciate, I see a lot of people also commenting, and I would love to address that if there's time for that. But I want to just make one more overall point. So we live in media. There is no in or outside to media anymore. That the recipe for survival in media tends to be media and information literacy or digital literacies. That literacy has come a long way, but the final hurdle it needs to cross is to move from a recipe to solve the problem of mediated communication to an acknowledgement that imperfection and inequalities are part of mediated communication, and to celebrate all our individual motivations, no matter how different and weird they may be, for actually being in media in the first place. I hope that that has contributed a little bit to your thinking and debating about this. And I would welcome any kind of questions or thoughts, also about other things. I mean, I had the privilege to work with Dennis McQuill on a handbook of everything, so I should be able to talk about everything.
Professor Devika, would you like to, she was very enthusiastic to ask something to you, please. Ma'am, you'll have to unmute yourself, ma'am.
Sorry. So I was like very keen when I read through the articles, the independent or the entrepreneurial journalism. How would that contribute to the pluralistic media environment?
Thanks. I appreciate that question. As some people may know who are logged in at the moment, is that part of the research I've been doing for the last couple of years, especially with my very dear friend and colleague Tamara Witske at the University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam, is research on journalists all over the world that have decided to strike out on their own, not so much as freelancers, but to set up their own news businesses. And we've literally been all over the world, regrettably not in India, but in Nepal. But also to Colombia and to Uganda, to South Africa, to Canada, to Italy, Denmark, Netherlands, Australia, I mean, everywhere. And everywhere you see journalists, including in India, setting up their own startups, their own businesses, their own news platforms, services. And we wanted to know, of course, how do they do that? How do they make it work? But also, what does this take? Not just in terms of money, but also in terms of personality, and what kind of people do these things, and what kind of idea of journalism do they have? And what we find, and I know research that Summer Harlow, among others, have done among Indian news entrepreneurs. What we found is that this life in media that we're all living in a digital environment that allows us to participate as much as consume, right? Because it's digital and computational, allows for a lot of new ways of being creative, both in an entertainment sense, but also very much in a journalistic sense. And that indeed, one of the primary reasons why all these journalists are doing this is because they get to make their own journalism. And they feel they can't do that anymore when they are just having a job at one of the mainstream media. Now, I'm not here to say they're right or they're wrong, but that's what they feel. And that feeling motivates a lot of what they do. Interestingly, that doesn't necessarily mean that the journalism that these startups produce all over the world, we've documented this in a book that came out last year called Beyond Journalism, published by Policy Press. It doesn't necessarily mean that all these startups, whether they're in South Africa or in the Netherlands or in Colombia, produce a radical new type of journalism, like with a voice that we've never heard before. Actually, no, there's still quite a strong commitment to what we would argue are the traditional ideals of journalism, right? Telling the truth and providing the public service and those kind of ideas. It's just that they feel they have more agency, more control over how they can do it and the way they can do it. Plus, with this aspect of creativity is a powerful mix. And it does remind me of what I've just said about the reasons these students on my blog talk about they love their media, right? They get to express themselves. They have some kind of control over their own voice. They get to play around a bit with who they are and what they like and what they don't like. And they develop this sense of community. They keep in touch with the people they care about. They share information. I mean, the reason why we use media in the first place is to have something to talk about with each other. And in a way, these motivations you see very much also in the way these entrepreneurial journalists talk about their work. And so that will be my final comment to your question, is that when we talk about entrepreneurship and being entrepreneurial, we often default to sort of more business and economics inspired notions of entrepreneurship. So we talk about business models and about money and investment and about capital and about taking risks and those kind of things. Interestingly, and perhaps also problematically, I don't know, most of the debates that we've had over the last 6-7 years of doing this research never ever mentioned any of that at all. For a lot of these journalists, being an entrepreneur means being in it together with your friends to tell stories that you care about, which is a very different definition of entrepreneurship than the definition that we often see in the handbooks of business and management. So, and of course, they still have to make it work. They still have to, pay the bills and those kind of things. But it's interesting that a motivation to becoming an entrepreneurial journalist, to becoming an entrepreneur, can actually be having fun, being in it together, and doing things that really matter to you, rather than making lots of money or having to do this because otherwise there's no jobs for you. So that I find a corollary between what I just told and the research I've done before.
So they're more concerned about creative independence.
Yeah, and of course there are different types of entrepreneurial journalists and different types of startups, but you could argue that at least the ones that we have encountered are largely in the category of people for whom being independent from mass media, from traditional media, is key, from defining journalism on their own terms, and doing things together. And then the digital aspect is generally seen in terms of its creative potential. In other words, I can do things online that nothing restricts me. Neither the platform of what I work on, if I work for a broadcast television station, I'm kind of forced that my item can only be 3 minutes long and it has to have these specific elements. That's the straitjacket of the platform. But online, hey, if I want to make an infographic, I make an infographic. If I want to make a photo gallery, I'll do that, right? It doesn't matter. Anything goes. And that potential, even though most of them don't necessarily engage with it all that much, is a powerful engine of that drives this kind of entrepreneurship.
We have a question from someone I think we all know, Anna Gladkova. She's popped in here to say, Mark, do you think the remaining digital divide in the world, also including digital literacy, can create inequalities in regard to media love too?
Thanks for that question. It's lovely to sort of see you, Anna. Anna and I, by the way, will be giving an online talk tomorrow in Moscow. This is some of the. I mean, I'm a huge friend and fan of Anna's work, so yeah, I'm really excited to see her here as well. Yeah, I've been thinking. Look, I'm a bit of a hippie in the sense that I think love can solve everything. But beyond that kind of cheap comment, for me it was interesting that when I was invited, very kindly again, thank you for contributing today on the topic of digital inclusion, that my first inkling was to see if the work that I was doing on love could help. And of course, I mean, when I was reading the work, including Anna's work on digital inequalities and digital exclusion around the world, I mean, we know kind of what that work tells us, right? Is that, like I said earlier in my talk, that society is unequal, and that inequality gets amplified in media. And the digital inequalities are compounded, in the sense that the combination of being from a certain socioeconomic background, with a certain level of education, in a certain age group, even a certain gender, those things sort of back on to each other to create a deeper inequality that exists in either of any of these variables. So in order for talking about digital inequality in terms of solutions, you have to find something that cuts across all of this. That doesn't only talk about, let's find a way to help women, teach women how to program a computer, or let's just find a way to offer a literacy program to senior citizens, or let's come up with a teaching platform that is accessible for people who never finished high school. Or that's all good and important, but it doesn't acknowledge that the inequalities experienced compound across all these categories. That if you're a woman, if you have low levels of education, if you're older citizen, then these things amplify any inequality that you can find in any separate category. So you have to find something that cuts across. And I think that, first of all, is an acknowledgement of why people use media and play with media and have media in the first place. And acknowledging what they get out of that, what is important to them, and how to talk about it in those kind of terms. So I think it's media love may address some of the existing inequalities that we find in digital and media and the media environment, in terms of offering us a discourse, like a narrative, a story that transcends all these categories and these boundaries. Also, boundaries between nations dealing with this. I think it's secondly, it acknowledges that, and this is not something that I came up with, but there's a beautiful book written in 1999 by the late Roger Silverstone. The book is called Why Study the Media? And in that book is a chapter on erotics. Now, before you all think that he's talking about sex or something like that, no. But he makes the argument that, look, the way we make sense of the world, and especially in and through media, is not just rational, logical, and factual. It's also, and perhaps even more so, very much based on pleasure, on fun, on enjoyment, and on feelings. And I would even argue that's all it is. I mean, as we know from research in neuroscience, that rationality is just another emotion. I mean, our entire way of making sense of anything is driven by emotions, by feelings. So we have to take them seriously, including those that are seen to be strictly for fun. Like, I mean, let's say, I'm assuming a lot of the students who are logged in right now might be fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, we love watching the Avengers and all that kind of stuff. Or some here who are logged in thinks that is shit. That is like the worst Hollywood crap. Like, commercial exploitation, awful American, Captain America. Who needs him, right? So those are two very strong emotions. Beautiful. We have something to talk about. One. Second, we know from research that even watching crap, like Hollywood drivel, whatever. I mean, I happen to be a fan, but that doesn't matter. But we learn things. I mean, it contributes to our repertoire of what being a good person is, or how we could be in the world, or give us a sense of. I mean, it's so funny to hear these actors often say that the most beautiful thing they get out of playing action heroes, like, for example, in the Black Panther, the movie, was young African American or black girls and boys walking up to them saying, like, because you were Black Panther, I started believing in myself and I could be anything. I mean, that's not a lie, right? That's real. So a second thing is that Media Love does is to help us acknowledge that whatever solution we think we come up with for digital inclusion and exclusion has to take the erotics of media as a starting point for debate. It establishes a framework where we can meet each other and talk about things, right? So that connects to the narrative I talked about earlier. And I think, thirdly, what I'm thinking about a lot is I want to refer back to the that blog that my students maintain, Why I Heart My Media, because what do we really learn from the way people talk about how they use media? And I think what we learn is what makes people happy. Like, what is the fundamental definition of happiness? One of the most powerful definitions is that you're happy when you feel like you have agency, like you can decide things to some extent for yourself. You're not completely locked in by by being a woman or living in India or being old or young or whatever, but that within that space you have some agency. Secondly, that you are competent or that you get better at doing stuff, that you learn, that you accumulates people and skills and ideas that you grow, right? That you're not stuck. And thirdly, that you belong to some community, some kind. It doesn't have to be even physical. It doesn't have to be your family. It can also be your fellow fans of playing some kind of online role-playing strategy game. But the idea of being related in a meaningful way to others, those three things are the essence of what it means to live a good life. Now, where do we find those three things? ideally in the people around us, but that's not necessarily the case. But we find them in media every time. I mean, we love to talk about how addicted we are to these devices. And look what happens if you let people not use this for 24 hours. They freak out. Well, yes, of course, you're making them less happy. Why on earth is that an insight? So, I'm sorry, I'm going off the rails here, but what I would say that love helps us to reframe debates about inequality and exclusion, to think about happiness, to think about, well, how can we think about tools and practices and platforms that contribute to that? So to give you a very clear example, why is fact-checking for journalism not helping with their credibility and trustworthiness? Right? This is one of the most frustrating debates for journalism today, is that, yes, for years and years and years, they are struggling with maintaining credibility and trustworthiness, whether that's in the Netherlands or in India or anywhere else in the world. Some countries is worse, some countries is a little bit better, but everywhere people have real or sincere questions about, can I trust the media? Can I trust journalism in particular? And especially this year, as a response to that infodemic statement by the World Health Organization, most news organizations in the world have started or have accelerated their fact-checking apparatus. Of course, journalists have always checked the facts, but now it's much more overt. Like they have columns and separate, even programs on television, like, is this statement true? And this is how we, did this. And I mean, you switch on the radio and there are like entire programs where you can call in and ask questions to experts who say, well, this is not true, this is true, and everything. Great, fact-checking. Now, the research suggests that this makes no difference to whether people trust you or don't trust you. But how is that possible? Well, it's the reason why this is because you're not getting why people come to you in the first place. Not for the truth or some rational, logical kind of argument. I read the news because this is what the real world looks like. There might be a handful of people somewhere that do that, but most people don't. Most people relate to you as a journalist as a person, and you trust somebody you know. Right? Trust is not something that lives in the sky or something. Trust is established in practice. And what has happened to journalism is that it's become more and more diverse from everyday practice. Where are the headquarters of mainstream news organizations? Can you just walk in and say hi and have a chat? No. Generally, we don't even know where these buildings are. They're hidden outside of big cities, behind walls, glass walls, and there's security guards, and emails and phone numbers of journalists are not published anywhere. And it's like, it's like they're really as far away removed, and then they hit you with fact-checking columns, which is basically another way of shouting at you, believe me. That's not how trust works. And so it's to appreciate, to go back to this, like establishing a relationship, being part of the same community, and to talk with your readers or your viewers, your audience, that way is much more likely to establish trust than by showing them that you've done your homework. Because I know journalists do their homework. God bless them, but it's just not enough. As Terry Flew, a professor in Australia, said last year at his presidential address at the International Communication Association, the truth is not enough. And it's such a beautiful, we need trust. And trust is feeling. There we go. Love. It all comes down to it. Love. Somebody should write a song about it. Thanks, Anna.
Wow, I think today we have had such a lovely session with you. I can't tell you, I was already a fan of yours. I've really become such a huge fan. This is amazing. We got so much of discussion, so many questions for you. But I think we've come to the end of today's session. We will probably have to wrap up now. Or would you want to take a couple of questions, sir?
Well, if you have time, if people want to stick around, I would love to address some of the comments that are coming in. So I mean, I'm fine, but I know it's evening now for you, so you probably have lots of better things to do. But maybe we can take a couple of more minutes. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. You can take your pick. Which question would you like to address now?
It's another beautiful thing of this online environment, right? There's like we can come up with a time schedule, but it doesn't really matter. It's yeah. I'm gonna look a little bit at the comments that have been made until now. Ganga writes, media being a tough and stressful job is also a threatful job. Yes, in a few parts of the world. What is the ultimate thing that makes you love media? One thing. And, this is a good point. I mean, like in our research, we also found startups in countries where they're illegal, like in Cuba, for example. Like we went to a startup in data journalism startup in Havana, where media are state controlled and you're not allowed to set up your own news organization or whatever. And in order to interview them, we couldn't go as interviewers, right? We had to go as tourists and sort of spontaneously meet people in sidewalk cafes and have a chat. But beyond, the methodological issues that brought, and this was one example in Cuba, but there's examples in other countries as well, where journalists were doing their work under conditions that were, unsafe. We met journalists working in Nepal after that horrible earthquake, and still doing their work and trying to get a weekly news show out on the air. It's like I sometimes refer to that when one of my students in Amsterdam, who is from a rich middle class background, living in her own apartment in downtown Amsterdam, is like, I don't know about my future. There might not be jobs. And I said, look, if these people can do it, sorry, but you have no excuse, right? And that's a horrible thing for me to say, because you can't compare these two things. I will say this. I understand that you can be frustrated or scared about, the world out there as a journalist. But often what you then forget is to look inside your own heart. It's like, why do you want to do this in the first place? And this love that we have for media is not just the love that we have as consumers of media. As you said in your introduction, I've done most of my empirical work in my career on media makers. And look, if there's one thing that unites every media professional that I've ever talked to, whether there was a journalist or a game developer or an actor or an actress in Hollywood or an advertising creative, they were most likely to tell me, Mark, I can't believe I'm getting paid to do this. I love this stuff. Right? So they love it too. Now, this is not an argument to say follow your passion and everything will be okay. No, that's like the worst advice that you can. If you do what you're doing simply based on your passion, you're more likely to be exploited, and also more likely to take everything that happens to you personally. When you get rejected from a job or something like that, and it's like, oh, they reject me as a person, and no, that is not what's happening here. But so don't follow your passion, but know your passion, right? To look it in the eye, to take it seriously. Where does your passion come from? How does your passion translate into what you think is good or right? That's what we found in these startups, journalism startups all over the world, is that they had a very clear idea of what good journalism was. Or is. Now, that's not necessarily a different kind of journalism than the journalism you'll find in mainstream media, mind you. But still, for them, it was their definition, their project. So they translated their passion into a very clear idea and mission. And that's what keeps you going. That's what provides, that is more sustainable than simply loving what you do. Loving what you do is one thing, that's lovely. But know what that love is about. Take it seriously. Look it in the eye. Go into therapy. I don't care, but take it. I mean, I guess that's the point of my entire story, is to take love seriously, and to not to dismiss it as something frivolous or fun or on the side or something private or something you only do at home. No. I'm sure there's a song that is about love is everywhere. Well, it's true. And it's not frivolous. It's real. It shapes the world you live in. And so yeah. So that would be my thing. So what is the one thing that makes you love media? And then it's like, well, that the love is the one thing, but love for you might mean something very different than it is for me. So and to take that seriously, to look at carefully. Another question Ganga asks is, which country do you think is doing the best in inclusive digital literacy? And how would you rate India on that scale? Look, that's really complicated. Like I said, digital literacy, digital inequalities and exclusion are compounded. And that means that it's not like, literacy in India versus literacy in Pakistan versus literacy in Australia versus literacy in the Netherlands. That comparison won't get you anywhere, because within and across these countries, you have systems of in and exclusion that relate to gender, that relate to age, to ability, to socioeconomic status, to employment, to level of education, and those all interact. So to separate one variable, like do the unemployed in India have access to the same kind of information as the unemployed? No, it cuts across, which is complex and frustrating, but it also offers a chance for us to start talking about this. Like, how can you come up with ways of talking about and developing programs for literacy and inclusion that roll across these categories, that aren't, while at the same time being mindful that you cannot just talk the same way. I'll give an example that Professor Gladkova from in Moscow might appreciate. When I first got to Russia, I had a meeting with the Dutch ambassador there. And he said, Mark, we have a problem. And maybe you can help as a media scholar. I said, okay, what's the problem? He said, well, we in the Netherlands find press freedom, today's World Press Freedom Day, very important. And we want to, make that point here in Russia as, from the embassy. That's an important policy point for us. But we find that whenever we want to organize something around press freedom, we get little or no cooperation, little or no feedback, or audiences, little or no support. What should we do? And I said, well, stop calling it press freedom. You're in Russia. Call it media literacy or news literacy. Right? That's a more inclusive term that can be about, how important it is to have an autonomous and independent press. But it can also be equally about how important it is to teach people that there's more than one source for every story, and that there's more than one truth for every fact. But press freedom is, in a lot of different ways, a very specific concept that means something very specifically, especially in the Western world, that you can't just copy and paste willy-nilly everywhere. And that's another way of talking about this too, is that, how do you compare India on a literacy scale with the Netherlands or with everything? Well, we are almost never talking about exactly the same thing, using the same language. And again, this is not a problem. Remember what I said about all mediated communication is essentially imperfect. Let's celebrate that. How do you, that's why I really hesitate to give definitions. Because definitions are almost always situational, right? They're produced from a specific background. They serve a very specific master. And especially in debates about inclusion and equality, you want things to be open. The same with love. I have a big debate with colleagues and with editors about, you're writing a book about love, but you should define love in the first chapter. And no. Why? In the literature, there's two camps. There's one camp that says, well, love is this. You have love for a partner, and love that relates to sex, and love that relates to friendship, and love for, the cosmos or whatever. And those are all related back to the works of Plato. Nice boxes, and there, that's love. And then you have a separate literature on love, often coming from feminist scholarship, which says, let's just let everybody talk about love in the way that is meaningful to them and see what that brings. Now, I find that much more inclusive. And while at the same time acknowledging the, I talked about the compoundness of digital inequalities. I mean, you can also talk about how intersectionality helps us to understand and appreciate how it works. And that's what you do. It's all about opening things up rather than closing them down. Anyways, I'm diverging, and if I do that even more, I'll be here 6 hours from now. Akana writes, today's media is AI-driven, artificial intelligence-driven, while media literacy is mostly a human or humanitarian effort. That's a great observation. Do you think we can keep pace with the AI-driven, dynamically changing media environment by our media literacy efforts? Wow, that's beautiful. Remember when I started my talk today, I said that our life in media is characterized by two seemingly paradoxical developments. On the one hand, we all must self-communicate, right? We all constantly add our own story to the media universe, whether directly by updating Facebook or indirectly by just generating data from using media. But on the other hand, we are all, to some extent, determined in our media experience through algorithmic selection, through artificial intelligences, but through machine learning, through automated systems to robots. Now, these terms all mean very different things, but you could say that, roughly speaking, if we live in media, wait a minute, does that mean that our lives are governed by humans or by machines? Right? That's at the heart of this discussion. And if we develop approaches to deal with this strictly based on what humans do, aren't we then basically surrendering to machines? I would love to talk a little bit more about this, but that would be a whole new talk. But it speaks to the fundamental issue of what to do now. We live in media, okay. We have, I would argue, three options. The first one is based on this, are we in control or are the machines in control? And what are we doing that maybe make the machines more powerful ultimately than us? First one would be, let's wage war on the machines. Let's find ways to destroy them, and that could be by making algorithms public, right? There's a big movement about that, by breaking up big tech firms and preventing them from becoming too powerful, to prevent Facebook from sharing data across Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook, for example. More transparency, more public oversight of algorithms. That's another way of waging war against the machines. So these are all different, you could say, approaches that share in this notion that the machines are ultimately things outside of us that we need to control, curtail, prevent from getting too big, too strong, too powerful. When I listen to arguments in support of that, and obviously all of that needs to be done, don't get me wrong, but if that's our primary approach, I'm reminded of a story. I'm sorry if it's a great story. We all know Charles Darwin, right? On the Origin of Species, arguably the most infamous scientific book ever published in the 1860s, giving us the theory of evolution. Now, what not a lot of people know is that one of Charles Darwin's childhood friends, a guy called Samuel Butler, he was about to emigrate from England to New Zealand around that time. And he got a copy of his old childhood friend's book on the Origin of Species. And he read the book while on the ship to New Zealand. Now, that takes a couple of months, right? So by the time he ended up in New Zealand, he fully digested the book and he was panicking. And he wrote an essay that was published in a local newspaper at the time. And in that essay, he said, look, if Darwin is right, and all living forms evolved from, the primordial soup and then evolved to adapt and accommodate to existing circumstances and get better and better while doing so, and survival of the fittest, then wait a minute, that argument is not just about humans, it's also about machines. And then he saw what was happening. He said, look, think about clocks. It's a beautiful example. Where did clocks start? In bell towers of churches, right? Of big buildings that have clocks on them, and they're ding, ding, and then you have the time. And then they moved into the home. We had clocks, and we hung them on the wall, and it did cuckoo, cuckoo, right, in the home. Now, in that time, in the late 19th century, what happened? Clocks became wristwatches. The first wristwatches were becoming available. And he said, oh my God, first they were outside and safe, far away. Then they moved into our intimate spaces in the home. Now they move onto our bodies. The next thing, they're going to move into our brains. They're going to take us over. We're all going to be robots. Kill them all. So that was his argument, right? So that's 200 years ago. And we're still having the same discussion. So I don't think war against the machine is the answer, but it is a answer, right? And another way you could say, like, let's just surrender. Algorithms are way too complex and powerful. Nobody really knows how they originally work anymore. Let's, to hell with it. Just surrender. It's fine. It's like there is it's like. It's what Donald Trump would say, like, it's a fact-free politics. It doesn't really matter what you say is true or not true. It's all, people will make something. The point is to energize people and inspire them, and that's what's really important. The rest is all, so completely surrendering and letting go. And you see quite a few people doing this. Also public, like I said, the president of the United States, the former president, was a good example of this. And then there's a third approach to AI and robotization and automation and everything, is to become a trustful part of it. Now, what do I mean with that? And I think that's an interesting and that is hopefully that you would get that from my talk today, is that you acknowledge that an algorithm isn't some kind of alien, creepy formula that lives outside of you that makes you do stuff, but that you are part of that algorithm, and algorithm is part of you, right? An algorithm is just an empty formula that is filled with you, like with your behavior, your clicks, your data. An algorithm is stupid. We are all stupid, right? So let's just start from that premise. And it also means that an algorithm isn't perfect, like everything isn't perfect. An algorithm is incredibly messy. Now, sometimes that has really problematic consequences, like algorithms can be racist. Algorithms put you on lists where you don't belong that can have consequences for whether you're going to get a mortgage or whether you can travel by plane or not or whatever. And those things need to be addressed. But by juxtaposing us as humans and AI and artificial intelligence and all that other stuff as something else, I think you get a fake, a false dichotomy, as we would say in academic terms, right? I mean, we're part of the same coin. There's an infodemic and a pandemic, right? They're not separate. We cannot take them apart and look at them separately and find ways to deal with them. So I'm not afraid of algorithms or of artificial intelligence taking us over, as long as we keep talking about them in a participatory way, right? That we're in this together with them, and that to some extent we trust that they do fulfill some really important functions. But like every other system, they are messy, incomplete, and in a lot of different ways problematic, just as we are. I think that is, in Media Life, I'm quoting a computer programmer who says, technology is messy, we are to deal with it. And I think that is, in a nutshell, the best possible answer to concerns about AI. Let's deal with the mess. One last thing, and then we'll because I can be here forever, and I'm sure you don't. So I'm gonna. There's several questions about what's going to be the future of the media 20 years from now. How can we fill existing and new digital divide gaps? That's what I really like. These are two different questions, by two different people in the chat, and I think it's important to relate to them. right? Because a lot of discussions about what are the future of media and communication, you get sort of these sort of Star Trek-y kind of visions of the future where self-opening doors and, you know, media everywhere and all that kind of stuff. Or you have a separate discussion about digital divide and inequality and how we're going to solve that problem in the future. And of course, they're connected, these two things. I think that, I mean, look, 20 years ago, we didn't have social media. We didn't have streaming video services. I mean, YouTube didn't exist. Facebook didn't exist. Twitter didn't exist. Instagram, TikTok, you know, you name it. Nothing existed. That doesn't mean that everything we do on those platforms is new. And that's the fun part. Actually, what we do there is very old. Gossiping, you know, laughing about each other, sharing silly stories about how you know, put a Mentos in a bottle of Coke and then it explodes. And that's what people have done in courtyards and marketplaces and pubs throughout history. I mean, if I talk with my students, I generally tell them, try to imagine or try to think of media as making you more human than you already are. It's like in media, we can actually find our common humanity. We find that others, I mean, I remember research, I don't know if what the Indian equivalent of this, but in Western media, you have these daytime talk shows where Jerry Springer was a very old example from the United States, but talk shows where often featuring celebrities, but also quite often just normal everyday people who would talk about problems live on television. A reality television in a way is like that too. These are the most popular and most watched television shows around the world, regardless of culture or nationality. And you would wonder, like, why would we watch that stuff? I mean, why would we watch people like us talking about problems we all have? I mean, come on, we have enough on our plate. Can't we just watch superheroes beating the shit out of each other for a couple of hours and then go to bed? I mean, tomorrow is another day where I have to feed my kids, go to the factory, and, you know, all of that. And the reason why we watch this is because, you know, we recognize ourselves in what we see. And we're like, oh yeah, I struggle with that too. Is that how they deal with it? Wow, I would never do that. Or that's it, I want to try that too. Or, you know, it's like, it's a constant negotiation between the boundaries that make you who you are and what make other people like you who they are. And then figuring it out. And so in that sense, if you look at all your media in those terms, not in terms of the technologies and the beautiful production value and the buttons and everything, but in terms of their humanity, of how they make you aware of our common humanity, I think that would be my preferred future of media, is that they and that in part means that they will have to become, and they probably will become, even more of an environment than they already are, even more ambient, all around us, all encompassing. Yes, I think that's a fair assumption to make about our media. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily make them more powerful to determine what happens to us if we use them in terms of their humanity instead of their technology.
Wow, today has been an amazing discussion. I can't tell you, Professor Deuze, we have gone through so many topics from every part of the world. I think I think more than anything else, it's commendable your in-depth knowledge about such a huge variety of topics, be it AI, be it communication, be it journalism. Wow. This is really brilliant. I wish we could have a much longer session. Maybe we could have given you 9 to 5 today. That would have been a good idea, probably. But we should do that again, definitely. But our students are all waiting. They're actually waiting for the announcement of the prizes.
Yes.
We had the debate competition and the quiz competition. So
Lovely.
they're, in fact, waiting for the prizes to be announced. So I shall do that right now. So great.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Always happy.
Thank you so much, sir. Our heartfelt gratitude to you for doing this for us. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. See you all soon.
Yes, good day, sir. Great, great, great. So this was a mentally invigorating session, a really interesting session. I'm sure those of you who are still tuned in are waiting eagerly for the results of the quiz as well as the debate. It was a very difficult call for us, and to be honest, I had not yet looked at, me and my panel of judges for the debate had not yet looked at the rating and the voting that you all had given for your friends and classmates, and but there were two names that we were equally confused about. And when I went and I checked out what is the grade that you have all given, I think it's the same. It turned out to be exactly the same. So let me put on the screen right now the winners of the live debate competition. Yes, these are the winners of the virtual live debate competition that happened today. I should be honest, all of the speakers, all 8 of them were amazing in their own way. Very articulate, very interestingly, well put out, well structured points. But these were the 2 who were popular with the voters, as well as they were also voted in by the judges. The first prize goes to Shakti Sneha, and the second prize goes to Rishabh. And the difference was just a very marginal difference. So congratulations to both of you. Now coming to the winners of the virtual live quiz competition, there were 3 of them who have got completely full marks in the quiz. Out of the many of you who had answered it, there were 3 of them who had got full marks. There were 2 very tricky questions, which I wasn't sure if you would be able to get. But since all the 3 got it right, we have decided to give all 3 of you the prizes. On your screen here, you can see the winners of the virtual live quiz competition. We have Dexter Masong Song Jr. from San Pedro College in Philippines. We have Ayush Kumar Jha, who's studying at DAV Public School in Jamshedpur. And we have Mr. Narendra Soni from the Guru Jambeshwar University of Science and Technology in Hisar, Haryana. Narendra Soni is a college student. The other 2 are school students. Great. Excellent. So, but there's something more. I need to give you the feedback code for filling out your feedback forms for this session. So let me put that on screen right now. Great. It's as simple as possible. It's just media. Great. So I'm sure let me call on Dr. Devika. I think she agrees with me that today has been a wonderful day, which has been a unique experience for us as organizers, and I'm sure for you too, as students and faculty participating in this event. Am I right, ma'am?
Yes, we as a team worked hard, and our participants were very interactive and made the show really interesting. And we have got experts across the globe with the support of our media partners, our event partner, and IAMCR. And with the support of our management, we were able to, and our principal ma'am, we were able to do the event very successfully. And not the least, our students were pillar of support for us. They got really involved in the debates. Not only debates, they supported us technically too in conducting the session. And I thank everyone, and I thank all the participants who participated in the sessions and made the session very lively and interactive.
Very rightly put. In fact, you'll be surprised, almost the entire event has been completely managed with the support of our students. I would like to take the time to read out their names. Abhishri from the first year of visual communication, Adriel from first year, Aishwarya V from first year, Ananya from first year, Anupama from first year, Arpita from second year, Bavadarni from third year, Laksh from first year, Mitisha from first year, Rishabh from first year, Sandeep from first year. Rishabh and Sandeep were your broadcast managers along with Anupama for almost the entire show. And Shakti Sneha from first year, Surinder from first year, Tirza from final year, third year, and we had Vikashni from second year and Yohit from first year. And of course, a heartfelt gratitude to the entire faculty fraternity who have supported and helped us for this particular event. And a sincere thank you to Dr. Vigila Kennedy ma'am, who has always been our backbone of support for any event, any endeavors of ours. Team Class Viscom definitely would definitely like to put out our thank you to the entire management of our college for giving us a lovely event today that we will cherish forever. Thank you so much. With this, we sign off. I'm Professor Ananda.
I'm Professor Devika, signing off.
Thank
Good
you
day
so
all.
much. Have a lovely day. Stay safe. Take care.